Yet another week, heading towards conclusion to China, and then we'll have a section on basically triumph of European colonialism, the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, and the ascension of the West, basically. So we're in the middle of the narrative discussing traditional or imperial China with the history, and we're continuing to look at the structure of things, the culture, and the socioeconomic base. And I left off last time. I was discussing the way the villages ran in this very old state, as I've explained. And of course, like all the other societies that we've considered, the landlord class, the ruling class, controlled most of the land, controlled the land. The producers, the peasants, and whatnot, they basically had to pay tribute and taxes and were subordinate to the landlords and the state. And in the case of China, which we saw, they had a very sophisticated state, way more sophisticated than anything in other civilizations. The state supported the landlords, and the landlords supported the state. I think that economic classes definitely existed in China as they did in Western Europe. And what I mean by economic classes, I mean that the landlord class in particular, and others as well, had significant private property rights, independent of the state. Unlike the Ottoman Empire or the Mughal Empire, where people like that, their ability to hold property was conditioned by the power of the king or the emperor or the sultan and so on. So China was a class society. There were different forms of property, but private property was significant in China, like in Europe. Now, as I explained, most of the land in the villages were controlled by the landlords. They controlled the local government. They controlled the local Buddhist temple, the benevolent society, the local government. It was all in their hands. Indeed, the ordinary peasants had to rent tools and draft animals from the upper class. The ordinary peasants didn't have these things, and often they fell into debt to the upper class. They were indebted to the upper class. That was the situation. Well, most of the time, of course, the peasants, as is true in most societies, they just accept the dictates of those who rule, those who are on top. But China went through cycles, and the land would become extremely concentrated, or there would be invasions or famine, and times would get really hard for ordinary people, and consequently, we do have a record based on an analysis of the historical annals, because, as I explained, the historical annals exist in this society dating way back, even before the Han Dynasty, 1,000 years before. You're beginning to get chronicles of what's going on, and scholars have found that, in fact, peasant revolts, local ones, and sometimes of more important proportions, were common in Chinese society. And I explained that some of the dynasties were actually overthrown by these very large, involving millions of people. The peasants would rise up, and they would overthrow the emperor, they would overthrow the dynasty, and then inevitably, when things settled down, things would go back, because there was no structural change in the society, things would go back to the same pattern, and the cycle would repeat itself. That was the way China's history had unfolded. And in fact, the dynasty that we're now considering, the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, arose from exactly this kind of huge mass peasant protest. The dynasty was actually founded by a young peasant from South China by the name of Zhu Wanzhang. Again, keywords, you'll find the name Zhu Wanzhang, who was born in 1328. Now, the reigning dynasty at that time, 1368, was the Yuan dynasty, spelled Y-U-A-N. And this dynasty had come to power a century earlier. They were Mongols. They invaded China and they destroyed the existing dynasty, and they, from 1279 until 1368, the Mongols ruled China. Now, one must remember that the Mongols were also active throughout Central Asia and down into the Middle East, and indeed into Europe, because a little bit later they, for example, conquered Russia. Russia became, most of Russia became part of the Mongol Empire. And an associated and subordinate people were the Turks, different Turkish tribes. We mentioned the Seljuks, we mentioned the Ottomans, we mentioned the Mughals. They came down into India, they came down into the Middle East. And, for example, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks were sort of pushed by the Mongols. And you have the Mughal Empire, which is really Turkish, again pushed by the Mongols, and also the Persian Empire. Likewise, the reigning dynasty was Turkish. In any case, a big peasant revolt developed because of the difficult conditions and because the Mongols were foreigners who invaded China. Amongst the peasants in South China, a big revolt, and this peasant boy became the leader of the peasant insurrection, Zhu Wanzhang. And he was extremely successful, and in 1356, by this time, his armies had grown to the millions. The rebels basically took the city, the important city of Nanjing in southern China. Still, Nanjing is really absolutely central. I lectured in Nanjing, one of the universities. It's a very beautiful place, Nanjing, and very good food. In any case, by 1368, the Mongols were expelled from China, and a new dynasty, the Ming dynasty, came to power, led now this peasant became the emperor. Wanzhang became the first Ming emperor. And when he became emperor in 1368, he moved the capital from Nanjing to Beijing. And one of the principal reasons for this was that there was a threat of further Mongol incursions from the north. And so strategically, Beijing was cited in terms of the defense of this now in Han dynasty. The Han come back to power. The Hans who have been conquered, they get rid of the Mongols and they're in charge now. And Beijing is the capital. And what was the program of Zhu Wanzhang? Well, first of all, it was basically a program to support the peasants, the base of Chinese society, agrarian reconstruction based on land reform. And what he did was to take away a lot of the land from the landlords. This was an agrarian reform. They seized the land, much of the land of the landlords, and they gave it to the peasants. So that we can say that by the end of his reign, 50% of the land was in the hands of the peasantry. 50% remained with the landlords, of course, but he didn't abolish the landlords as did Mao Zedong in the Chinese Revolution of 1949. He didn't get rid of the landlords. He basically redistributed the land. Perhaps if he had gotten rid of the landlords, the reform would have remained permanent. And as you'll see, the landlords came back, and the peasants lost out ultimately. But at the beginning, this was a big deal. And he went even further, and he reformed the whole sort of bureaucracy, so that by the end of his reign, 50% of the mandarins, the bureaucrats who ruled, 50% of them came from the peasantry, whereas ordinarily the mandarins were more or less exclusively recruited from the landlord class. Now, ordinary, talented young peasant boys from the peasantry had opportunity. So that was an extremely important reform. And he took other steps that are interesting. By the time he came to power, the Ming army was 2 million men strong, 2 million men. I made the point that these armies were enormous, way larger than the armies of the West. And I said, you can watch some of this action on YouTube, because they have lots of these Chinese films with showing these huge imperial armies. In any case, he insisted that the army be self-supporting, that it shouldn't be a burden on the peasants, on the ordinary people. So the army was forced to grow its own food. It had to grow its own food so it wouldn't be a burden on the people. And the whole system of canals and roads, which had fallen into decay, was restored under this first Ming emperor, and a whole system of messaging, royal couriers, and so on. This was he established a very strong setup, enabling him to create a very strong central government. But with that being said, nevertheless, the army was a burden on the people, but so was the bureaucracy. So he, as much as he could, he decentralized the government. He put many of the administrative and judicial offices at the local level and away from the center to lessen the tax burden on the ordinary people. And of course, he fought bitterly against corruption. There's this regimes are always fighting against corruption. That's standard. But real change is always structural. Politicians who talk about getting rid of corruption without really taking seriously, the structures of things, this is just demagogy. And so the structures here remain the same, and so the corruption comes back. That's what happened under the Ming. Now, the foreign policy of China is very interesting. It is based on what we call the tributary system, or the system of kowtow. Again, the key word is kowtow, the tributary system. That is to say, whereas in the West, by the late 15th, 16th century, it was the established practice. Diplomacy existed between the different states, France, England, Spain, etc., and diplomatic embassies were sent in Europe. The different states sent ambassadors, as we see. In other words, the system that we still have in place existed in Europe already by the end of the 15th century. But in China and in East Asia, because of China's overwhelming power, the other states, which were much smaller, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, etc., Burma, these states were regarded by the Chinese as inferior offshoots of Chinese culture. And for them to have any relationship with the court in Beijing, they had to kowtow. They had to basically, the way they related was by doing obeisance, sending ambassadors, and the ambassador would accept. We are your underlings. You're doing us a favor by having diplomatic relations with us. And it is true that all the states I've mentioned, in terms of, first of all, they were smaller, but also they were variants. The structure of all of these states that I've mentioned basically was a variation on the whole Chinese structure of an emperor, a bureaucracy. The whole setup was the importance in many cases of the teachings of Confucius. You see this in the different countries. And I would say that this system, in a certain way, we could say it worked because while I underline that the Chinese were aggressive, just like the Europeans were aggressive, or the Ottomans were aggressive, so the Chinese were aggressive, but there weren't that many wars in the East. If you compare it to the West, where I said that war was an institution, war never ceased in the West because of the rivalries between these different states. The tributary system sort of inhibited the development of war. So that's, and I would say that this all has to be seen very much in sort of cultural terms. The Chinese regarded themselves as basically the top people. They were culturally the most advanced. They were the most civilized. They had the most powerful state based on the neighboring states. They regarded themselves as superior. They suffered from what we call ethnocentrism. Remember at the beginning of the course, I stressed this concept of ethnocentrism. And that was all, and of course, this was reinforced by the fact that the Chinese economy was largely self-sufficient. They didn't need that much from other countries. China produced most of the things, the food, the manufactured goods. Other countries came to China to get silk or to get porcelain or what have you. China didn't need products from other countries. And so this sense of we're self-sufficient, we're top, our philosophers, our culture is the center of the world. That's basically what they thought. And of course, it set themselves up for a terrible blow when the West penetrated Asia and the West ultimately invaded China because they said to them, well, we're the best. How come we're losing? And how come these Westerners have this science, I'm talking now about the 19th century, how come they have this incredibly powerful science and technology? They had no way of coping with this because we're talking now about the upper class, their sensibility. And of course, it was only as the 19th century wore on that some intellectuals began to say, listen, we've got to change, otherwise we're going to be destroyed. And so, in order for China to survive, these Chinese intellectuals began to assimilate Western ideas. And at first, it took the form of merely sort of bringing in some Western science and technology, and then I would say, a middle-class movement of nationalism began to develop in China in the face of Western imperialism, Western and Japanese imperialism. And ultimately, as things got worse and worse and worse, you have the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, which begins to change the picture over time. In any case, that was the setup. Now, all of that having been said, one of the interesting features of the Ming period, especially the 15th century, was that the state sponsored a series of 8 great voyages. I said that they were self-sufficient, but in the 15th century, parallel to what the Spaniards and the Portuguese were doing, that is to say, setting out on the high seas, the Chinese state organized a series of voyages which cruised from port to port in the Pacific Ocean and in the Indian Ocean, visiting different important commercial centers. And some scholars said, well, things might, based on when this became generally known to historians, some historians have said, well, things could have been reversed. Instead of Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Magellan, the Chinese could have entered the Atlantic and visited Western Europe, and they could have discovered America. Some scholars even today insist that the Chinese actually preceded Columbus in the course of these voyages. There's sort of an argument about this, speculation about this. What I think that this is a sort of a mistaken view, because however interesting this is, the Western voyages were basically motivated by economics. Remember, the Mediterranean route was jeopardized. All of the goodies, all of the luxury goods, the spices, the silks, the porcelains, all of that came from Asia, and the Europeans wanted to reach Asia. But the Chinese didn't have any need. It didn't have an economic need to reach Europe. There was nothing there for them, except ultimately gold, or I should say silver. The Indians preferred gold, and the Chinese preferred silver. In any case, what I'm saying is that these voyages the motive was not economic, it was political. And why was that? Well, because starting in the 12th century, from southern China, a lot of Chinese people left China and as merchants and set up in the neighboring countries, in Korea and Vietnam and Thailand, in the Philippines. Chinese, what we call the overseas Chinese community, began to develop uh, out of southern China from the 12th century. And it was becoming more and more important. And we'll see in the Ming period, it continues to be an important political factor. And the Chinese state organized these voyages in order to bring these merchant communities under close control. They were bringing merchandise into China, they were doing all sorts of things which violated imperial laws. Contraband and so on was being brought into China. And so the Chinese state was trying to basically establish political control over these merchants. And notice this, they are trying to control the merchant class. They are trying to control the middle class, the merchant class. They want to control the middle class. And you'll see this is happening also within China, because the Chinese state and the landlord class, it's the landlord class, it's a bureaucratic apparatus, and there is a hostility to the middle class. And we'll see this reflected even in the philosophy of Confucius. Okay? So there's, of course, merchants are necessary. Certainly Confucius, who's the basis of their ideology, accepts this. But he's hostile to the merchants. And that is the outlook of this landed class and this bureaucracy. These people, I'm now going to use a vulgarity, are shit disturbers. The merchant class, they're all about change and the market and manipulation and getting the better of the other person. That's not what Confucianism is about. Confucianism is about order, stability, and these merchants represent a threat. In fact, if we look at China today, same thing. Same tension exists. This whole issue of Hong Kong and the big shot, the billionaire class in China, suppression by the communist government. So I'm saying that there's a certain continuity here that we have to recognize. Now, in contrast, I just want to say that the Europeans, they were driven to come to Asia and to China because they were seeking luxury goods, and the Europeans had a problem because the balance of payments, silver and gold, was constantly, they took it from Latin America, but it was constantly draining away to India and China. So there was this constant balance of payments problem. So that gives you the basic, some basic idea how things worked. I want to say just a little bit more about the Confucius. For him, the landlord class was tops in society, the landlord class, the natural rulers. But then, second to them were the craftsmen, and below them were the peasants, and lowest of all were the merchants. That would be the best order for Confucius. But the reality was, and this I need to stress, was that in the Ming period, and then later in subsequent dynasty, the merchants kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they threatened this whole state apparatus. So there is a class struggle going on in China, and I would say that a kind of proto-capitalism does develop in Chinese society, a definite proto-capitalism, especially in the 16th and the 18th centuries. There is a proto-capitalism, or what Chinese scholars refer to as the sprouts of capitalism. However, given the structure that I've outlined here, this was all stillborn in the sense that the Chinese state and the landlord class never allowed this capitalist class. What we see in Europe is the same thing, only the middle class breaks through, first in Holland, then in England, and later on, eventually, during the French Revolution. That doesn't happen in China, and the only way that things really ultimately change is that Western capitalism, Western imperialism, breaks apart. We're now talking about the 19th century, breaks apart the structure of imperial China, and it begins to disintegrate under the stress of Western attack. I've mentioned, of course, the Restoration. I've mentioned the foreign policy. But I want to now just mention the great importance of Confucianism under the Ming, because the Ming, now Confucius had been the established philosopher in China, the state philosopher, since the Han period, since China became a unified state way back in antiquity. However, the Ming state is notable because of its orthodoxy. As a means of political control, the state would not permit alternative ideological perspectives. No, there's only one truth, and that truth is Confucius, and anybody who deviates in any way from this is a danger to the state and is to be dealt with accordingly. So an extreme orthodoxy, intellectual orthodoxy, which can prove fatal, develops under the Ming dynasty. Circumstances were such that there was this incredible intellectual orthodoxy in China during the Ming period. And so what we see is that any kind of innovation can only express itself within the terms of Confucianism. There can be no alternative sort of ideological positions. And so what you have is a series of what we can call neo-Confucian movements in Chinese intellectual life. Confucian scholars, but who are taking up really extreme positions in terms of, can't get into this, the metaphysics and the sort of ethical system of Confucius. They take these extreme positions in the name of orthodoxy. It's always, we have the answer, the true Confucius. That's the idea. We are the true interpreters of Confucius. And so we see the first of these occurs at the beginning of the 16th century. There's an intellectual by the name of Wan Yangming, very important Confucian scholar historically. He founded a whole school, a whole new school, quite different from what had been the reigning interpretation of Confucius. And this group that followed this philosopher began to set up separate schools, independent of the state schools, in order to sort of teach their version of Confucius. Well, this was seen as politically dangerous, and in 1579, the state intervened and basically purged all these people, and some of the leaders were, in fact, executed by the state. But this did not go away, because no sooner did this movement disappear than another movement, which was based on, it's called the Donglin, again in key words, Donglin, Donglin Academy, came into existence. And again, these people tried the same maneuver. And again, they were crushed. And this time, hundreds, if not thousands, of followers of this Donglin Academy were executed between 1624 and 1627. And then finally, in the succeeding years, something called the Restoration Society, going back. It's always in terms of going back to the so-called original interpretation of Confucius. Now, we see this, this too was suppressed by the state. So there were three of these important movements. We see this in other cases as well. We see this in Islam, where from time to time in various places, a kind of orthodoxy. Islam has had its more liberal periods and it has its more conservative periods, and that's related to the political and social circumstances. It happened in Islam, and it has happened repeatedly in Christianity, in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, as well as in Roman Catholic Christianity. This extreme orthodoxy takes hold, and you really can't express anything except in terms of this orthodox. And I would point out that we see this even in secular terms. For example, in the history of Marxism and the Soviet Union, we could say that during the period of Stalin in the 30s and 40s, a similar Marxist orthodoxy, it was not true of the previous period, and is not true today, but in that period, there was, at the cost of your life, possibly, if you expressed heterodox opinion, your life was in danger. And this rigidified, I would say it's very important in terms of explaining the ultimate demise of the Soviet system. You could only express things in terms of this, I'm more orthodox. This is the true interpretation. That sort of mentality dominated. So it's a repeated theme in history. So what I'm basically getting at is that the Ming, intellectually and culturally, the Ming dynasty was extremely conservative. And that was too bad because this period was a period of huge social and economic advance. And the attitude of the Ming state was reactionary, frankly. They were very defensive. The population increased dramatically under the Ming dynasty, from less than 100 million at the beginning of the dynasty in the middle of the 14th century. By the middle of the 17th century, the period when it declined, the population rose to 300 million people. So you're beginning to get a population problem. Where are these people going to get? These people are mainly peasants. Land shortage becomes a problem. At the same time, as you have this population increase, you have vast commercial development in this period. Tremendous expansion of the commercial economy and population growth characterizes the Ming period. Especially important was the Yangtze River, which is comparable to the Mississippi River in the United States. It's more important. Rises in the Himalayas and flows down into the Pacific, basically. And it's along this that a vast network of commercial activity developed under the Ming, reaching its crest in the 16th century. In the 16th century. So you have, as I say, many cities, many towns, much manufacturing going on in the Yangtze River, especially the production of textiles, and above all, cotton and silk. And the thing is that a lot of this, more and more of it, is devoted to export. There is people have money in China and they're buying these textiles, but a lot of this is now being exported all over Asia and to the West. In South China, in the extreme south, near Vietnam, in that area, you have a very big tobacco and sugar industry with processing factories developing in the very south of China. The Chinese become heavily addicted to tobacco, and even, although there are campaigns against it, incessant smoking of tobacco, and ultimately opium develops in China. These become big industries. We also have the importation. Tobacco came from the New World, right? And more or less sugar, likewise. But we also have, from the New World, the Chinese imported sweet potatoes. These were being from Latin America, all these tomatoes, corn. It spread to Europe and it spread to China and India as well. Well, in China, of course, corn does develop, but also sweet potato and peanuts. And all of these things are rich in calories, and they facilitate this other sources of food. Rice and wheat were the main sources of food. Well, now you have these supplements, and additional calories can support a growing population, connecting that with the increase in population. Last but not least is the development of the porcelain industry. It's there from the late Middle Ages, but it really begins to take off in the 16th, especially the 17th and 18th century. And that is basically northwestern China. You can see this is away from the coast, northwestern, and an immense porcelain industry for the domestic market, but also for the European market. The European elites go crazy for Chinese porcelain. So silk and porcelain and ultimately tea become the big exports to Europe from China. Tea in the 17th century, but porcelain and silk already in the 16th century. And the porcelain industry is immense. I saw some figure about, for example, the Dutch in the 17th century. Some 3 million vases were exported from China to Holland for dissemination in Europe during the 17th century. 3 million pieces. So it gives you a sense. This is very substantial. This industry was partly run through state factories, but there were actually veritable private capitalist factories producing this porcelain. So there's this capitalist industry, porcelain industry in northwestern China. And so, of course, to come back to this idea of the sprouts of capitalism, one has to conclude, and there was certainly a development of wage labor also, that yes, an incipient capitalism and a growing middle class is present. But of course, it never really takes off because the state and the landlord class are the dominant elements in the Chinese political system, and they will not permit it. In any case, Nevertheless, what we see is that despite the state's suspicion, a huge partnership develops between Chinese merchants and overseas merchants. Europeans, but other Asian merchants, arrive on the shores of China in growing numbers, and the Chinese state has a lot of difficulty controlling this trade. They want to tax it, they want to control it, and it becomes a serious problem in the 16th century. And also notable is the influx of silver into China. The Ming state had experimented with a paper currency, but from the late 15th century onwards, with this enormous economic expansion that is going on, it's parallel to what's happening in Europe, as we recall. China is flooded with silver, and silver becomes the unofficial money of China. The largest part of commercial activity is carried on by basically the exchange of silver. Now, I would say that the basic foreign policy was to control these foreigners, particularly these foreign merchants, and was to control the Chinese borders. It is during the Ming period, especially in the 15th and 16th century, that the Great Wall of China, built by millions of peasants, one of the great sights of China, was built in the 15th, and it was meant to block invasion from the north and slightly to the west. The chronic problem of invasion by these pastoral warriors from the Asia, setting up this huge wall to basically block these foreign invasions. Then again, when in Vietnam, a civil war broke out, and there was the dynasty that took power was hostile to China. The Chinese invaded and put their people back in charge. In 1590, the Japanese invaded Korea and attempted to seize Korea, and a brutal war occurred in Korea between the Chinese state and the Japanese in 1590. Again, essentially the Chinese attempting to control the situation. Now, I'll stop at this point, and we'll resume in the next class.